Hello， 大家好，我是张小俊。这是一档试图探索和描摹我们时代的商业文化和新知的播客节目。一转眼，我们已经来到2022年的尾巴了，现在进入倒计时。先在节目里给大家拜一个早年，大家元旦快乐，新春快乐。上期节目里，很多听众留言说希望听到作家的英文原声，所以我决定临时加更了一期。这期播客的访谈对象是塞巴斯蒂安·马拉比，他是一名非常绅士的英国记者和作家，出版过许多商业读物，包括记录对冲基金历史的《富可敌国》、格林斯潘传记。他也2次入围了普利策。而他的妻子同样是一名优秀的记者，现在是全球知名期刊《经济学人》的总编辑。这次采访内容和他的新书《The Power Law》有关，这本书揭露了硅谷风投的隐秘故事。而在这期播客里，你能听到一部由他口述的硅谷风投史。不过呢，如果你想听的不是英文版，而是中文版本，就请移步我的上期节目。上期节目是有中文配音的。希望这次用声音带你纵览硅谷风投的历程。我对您这本书的英文书名 The Power Law 很感兴趣，为什么选择用密次法则作为书名呢？
I chose the Power Law because it's sort of the secret key to how venture capital works. Most kinds of investing, you think about a normal distribution. So that's where there's a big bell curve. And most of the investments you might make will have a return, a gain or a loss, something near the average. But with venture capital, most of them fail because most startups fail. But there are a few that make enormous profits, 10 times, 20 times the investment. And that's a very different kind of investing and forces you to think differently. And so I thought the Power Law was the right title.
能不能聊聊您为什么写这本书以及您的采访和写作历程？
Yes, well, with the writing process, the key thing for me is always to speak to the most important people in the field. And so I take a long time because these people are busy and important. And usually they say no when I first ask them. So it takes about 4 or 5 years to see all the people I need to see and interview maybe 200 or so top venture capitalists, and then win their trust, and they tell me lots of stories. And then in a way, the writing is the easy bit. So if I take the example of Sequoia, which is, of course, the most important venture capital company, very big in the US, very big in China. At the beginning, Sequoia did not want to speak with me. They said, you know, they have all these secrets. And so why would they talk to a writer? They're the best in the world, so they don't need to speak to anybody. But after a while, I had met all of the people who used to work for Sequoia in the past. And I had worked with a lot of people who had been invested in the same startups as Sequoia, and therefore they had been sitting next to Sequoia partners at the board meetings of the startups. And I had met investors who put money in Sequoia. And so I think the people at Sequoia decided that I already knew quite a lot about them. And so in the end, it was better to speak to me than not to speak to me. And then once we started talking, I think they liked it. And they spoke to me for hours and hours.
您的书开篇就开始探寻风险投资的起源，然后您很快将读者带入到了1957年几个背叛者的故事。诺贝尔奖得主肖克利的8名年轻的研究员不服他的高压管理，奋起反抗，自立门户。叛逆是风险投资的起源吗？
Yes, I think rebellion is the origin. I call it sometimes liberation capital.
Yeah.
Because the venture capital frees the entrepreneurs, you know, to leave a big company, rebel against the boss, and then start up a new company based on a whole different way of thinking.
我非常喜欢您用的这个词，就是解放资本。您用这个词给风险资本做了一个全新的阐释。您想通过这个词表达什么呢？解放资本改变了什么？它解放了谁？以及它塑造了一代人的商业文化吗？
Yes, I mean, in the 1950s in Silicon Valley, First of all, it was not called Silicon Valley yet because there was no semiconductor business. And secondly, the typical culture was that engineers worked at one company and they stayed there and they didn't leave. And the first story in my book is about the 8 traitorous engineers who did leave one company and they started Fairchild. But that was called being a traitor because it was so unusual. But with venture capital, being willing to put money behind engineers who wanted to start a new company, the culture did change, and starting a fresh company became normal. And so I think it liberated all kinds of people with ideas to try things out and experiment. And that really did change the culture of Silicon Valley.
马拉比先生，您的书围绕着一些重要的基金和重要人物展开，我想跟您聊聊那些撼动风投史的大人物们。很有意思的一点是，风险投资史上的大人物们似乎都有一个悲惨的家庭出身和不快乐的童年。第一个现代意义上的风险投资人阿瑟洛克先生就经历了严酷的童年，他患有小儿麻痹症。红杉资本的创始人唐瓦伦丁的父亲是一名卡车司机，家庭不曾拥有过银行存款。还有孙正义，就像您写的那样，他是白手起家的极端案例。为什么会这样呢？这种背景背后是否有某种共通的动机或者联系
？Yes, I think there is. I think that if you grow up in tough circumstances and you are not part of the elite, it's maybe harder to join an existing prestigious company and get along with everybody and naturally, rise up towards the top. And because you are a bit different in your attitudes and your upbringing, and you haven't had that advantage, you have to start your own company or start your own venture capital company. And so I think that coming from an unusual background makes you do unusual things later.
这意味着相比豪门望族来说，风险投资这个职业更适合于平民子弟吗？在今天它还是如此吗？
I'm not sure that it has to be blue collar. I mean, Masayoshi Son, for example, was, grew up poor and he was Korean in Japan and the Koreans were discriminated against. But on the other hand, he, went to Berkeley and, went to high school in California. And so he had some advantages. He wasn't really blue collar by the time he was in his teens. He was on a path towards, a more successful life. So I'm not sure you have to be blue collar, but I think it's good to be a bit different. So Arthur Rock, not really blue collar, but he had been sick as a child with polio, and that gave him a different approach.
So what did their childhood experience bring to their venture capital career?
Yeah, I think it's just, being a bit different, not thinking the same as everybody else. And so the idea that a radical new idea for a business might work feels more normal because you're not connected to the status quo. You believe in disruption because you didn't come from the establishment.
让我们来分别看看这些大人物吧。风险投资历史上的第一个重要人物是阿瑟洛克，为什么这个人对于风投史来说这么重要？
He's the most important because he did the first successful venture capital deal in California, and that was starting the first semiconductor success story with Fairchild Semiconductor. But later he also backed Intel, Apple, and a few other successful stories.
在书中您提到说他的一个贡献是设计了有限合伙的机制，这是我们今天常常说到的 LP。他的基金一开始就先募集资金，并且承诺有7年的存续期。这样的机制设计给风险投资带来了什么呢？
Yes, that's a good question. So I think the time-limited fund idea of about 7 years forces the venture capitalists to, hurry up and make investments and put some pressure. Not, 7 years is still quite a long time, but you can't just take 15 years. And the other thing is that having the money ready means that if a great entrepreneur arrives, the investor knows that he can put money in the company. Before Arthur Rock set up this first venture capital fund, he would meet a company, and if he liked it, he had to go specifically to investors and say, please invest in this company. But with a fund, he had the money already, and that was much faster.
但是我也很好奇，为什么阿斯洛克这样的行业的开创者却没有能够成功的创立一家像红杉或者凯鹏华银这样名噪一时的基金？
Yes, I think because he was such a loner, he didn't like to build teams. He liked to operate by himself. And when he had partners, in his first fund and then his second fund, he had one partner. They didn't tend to end up friends.
Oh, why?
I think because he was clever, but prickly, if you know what I mean. He would not be that friendly. And so I did spend quite a lot of time with Dick Kramlich, who was the second partner he worked with.
Oh.
And Dick Kramlich really didn't like Arthur Rock. He's a loner. Again, maybe that's to do with being different, growing up with polio, being bullied when he was a child because he was Jewish and not physically strong. He wanted to be his own man and be independent. He didn't really like to start a whole organization. I got to know him pretty well, and I think he enjoyed being independent. He made plenty of money for himself.
Okay.
So he became a wealthy man. But there are people like that who just prefer to be the boss. I mean, let's say Kathy Zhu from Capital Today in China. When I went to meet her in 2019, I think she was thinking about these issues because she asked me a lot about the American venture capitalists who either did or did not build lasting organizations. But I think Kathy Zhu is somebody who, likes to be the boss of her own company and did not want to join another partnership. She was asked to join Qiming and she didn't want to. And some people are just very independent and they can do very well. And so there's nothing wrong with that. But they don't necessarily create organizations that last for 50 or 60 years.
接着唐瓦伦丁和汤姆帕金斯登场了，他们分别创立了红杉和凯鹏华银，他们也是新的投资风格的先驱。在您看来，他们与阿斯洛克的不同是什么？
Well, they did create lasting organizations. Don Valentine created Sequoia, which is still a very powerful company, and Tom Perkins created Kleiner Perkins. And that's gone up and down a bit, but it's still very much alive. And probably it was the number one company in the world for venture capital 20 years ago. So that was 30 years after it was started. So definitely they both created lasting institutions. So one idea they had was that they created the idea of stage by stage investing. So when a startup came to ask for money, they didn't give all the money that it wanted, but they gave a bit to give it maybe 6 months or 9 months to try to prove itself. And then if it reached a milestone of progress, then they would give more money. So that stage by stage idea was important. And the other thing is hands-on investing. They would go on the board of the company and be very active in shaping it. Arthur Rock would go on the board too, but he was a bit less involved in either the marketing or the engineering. And I think Tom Perkins, who himself was an engineer and had set up a laser company himself, was more involved in shaping some of the early companies that he backed, like, for example, Genentech.
您花了一整个章节来写红杉，在您看来，为什么红杉成为一家长久的利于鳌头的风投机构？为什么作为双子星的另一家机构海鹏华银却没有能够做到这一点？红杉在投资决策、机制设计和组织文化方面做对了哪些事情？
I think the big difference between Kleiner Perkins, which fell from the top rank, and Sequoia, which remained at the top, was the amount of energy that the leaders put into management. Sometimes, venture capitalists are terrific investors. They love going to meet entrepreneurs. They love making bets on startups. but they don't really think about their own venture capital company. And the problem with John Doerr, who was the dominant partner at Kleiner Perkins, was exactly that. He was very charismatic and a fantastic salesman, very smart, knew a lot about engineering. He had been an engineer at Intel, but he didn't really focus on the management of Kleiner Perkins. In contrast, Michael Moritz and Doug Leone, the top people at Sequoia, were very, very focused on, how you hire young investors, how you encourage them, how you develop them, how you think about the company culture when you sit around a table and you decide on Monday morning whether to do an investment or whether to say no to that investment. What is the dynamic around the table? How do you use decision science, behavioral science, to improve the quality of your decisions? Sequoia was very focused on all these internal management questions, whereas Kleiner Perkins was not.
我们可以从红杉身上学到什么？
I think we can learn a couple of things. One is not to stay the same. You've got to change all the time. I mean, Sequoia in about 1995 was a, fairly small company that only invested in Series A at the beginning of a startup's life, and only really in Silicon Valley. But 10 years later, it had set up an office in China. It had set up a growth business to write much bigger checks to bigger companies. It was thinking about starting a hedge fund. It was changing in all these different ways. And I think that's one of the keys to staying on top, is to innovate your organization. And the other thing, I think, is, again, to focus on who you hire and really put energy into developing the people. So a good example would be that Roelof Botha, who is today the boss of Sequoia in America, was hired when he was very young, in his 20s still. And one of the oldest investors came to him and said, listen, let's do a deal. When you invest in your first company, we'll be a partnership, two of us. We'll go together to the company board meetings. I will be on the board at the beginning, and you will watch how I do it. And then if the company fails, it will be my fault. I will be the board member, and it will be my black mark on my name, which I don't care about because I'm already an experienced investor. But for you as a young investor, that would be a problem if you had a black mark. But if the startup company does well, then we'll quickly switch positions. You will be the board member, and if it succeeds, you will have the plus point, the halo, and you will have the Midas reputation. So that was a very generous thing for the older investor to do, to mentor the younger investor and to make sure the younger investor got a success story next to his name. And I think that's something that Sequoia does, maybe other venture capital companies do not do. Well, I think it's interesting that when Don Valentine started Sequoia, he didn't call it Don Valentine Partnership. He called it by the name of a famous tree in California. So he didn't put his own ego on the door. Whereas the other partnerships at the time, Kleiner Perkins, were named after, Eugene Kleiner and Tom Perkins, or Arthur Rock and Company, named after Arthur Rock. And there were other examples like that. So I think Don Valentine deliberately didn't put his name on it, deliberately wanted to create a partnership with other people. And interestingly, in the 1980s, when he had recruited a few other people, but he was clearly the powerful founder, when they had meetings together, Don Valentine did not speak at the beginning because he didn't want his own opinion to set the pattern for the conversation. Mm-hmm. He encouraged somebody else to lead the meeting, and that way everybody felt free to express their own opinions. And I think that tells you how Don Valentine did create the sort of DNA of the partnership, which deliberately encouraged younger people to step up. And the last thing that Don Valentine did, which was a really big contribution, is that he decided to retire before he really needed to. Nobody was pushing him out of the door, but he decided to step back, hand the leadership to Michael Moritz and Doug Leone, and to really kind of let them lead, even though they were much younger and less experienced. And so, again, it was not about his own personal ego. It was about building a lasting institution.
这是您为什么说风险投资是一项团队运动吗？
Yes, and I think that team sport phenomenon is partly about making the partnership last for 50 years or more, but it's also about specific investments. There are times when several different people can manage to get an investment to work if they work together as a team. And, one example would be the investment in Facebook that was done by Accel Capital. It was first identified by a very young associate who was not even a proper member of Accel, but was a student at Stanford. And Accel was, paying him a bit of money to bring ideas that came up from, Stanford. And he noticed that Facebook was popular amongst Stanford students. And so he told one of the people at Accel Capital to check it out. That person was called Kevin Efrasy, and he checked it out. And he did the early work of trying to get Facebook to talk to him. Then he brought one of the founders of Accel, who was maybe 60 years old, to come and see them. And the two of them, one of them aged about 30, one of them aged about 60, jointly assessed Facebook. And then it took another investor who was in between, maybe 45 years old, to finally persuade Facebook to let Accel be the one to invest. So it was a team of multiple people. And that was Accel. But again, if we go back to Sequoia, they have a habit when they have a successful exit and one of their companies is sold or has an IPO, they write a memo that lists all of the different people at Sequoia who contributed to the success of the investment. And they emphasize the team, not the individual.
Is the young person's game?
Well, I think it can be the young person's game, partly because, entrepreneurs are often quite young, and it helps to be, the same sort of, it can help to be the same age when you are trying to build a relationship, but it depends. If we take the example of Bill Gurley at Benchmark, one of the all-time fantastic investors, he was quite a bit older than Travis Kalanick when he invested in Kalanick and Uber, which of course was a very big success. So sometimes experience, if it is coupled with emotional intelligence, right? Mm-hmm. So that an older investor who has the experience, has the authority, but has the emotional skills to connect with a younger entrepreneur, that can be a very powerful combination.
我非常喜欢您在书中说到的一句话：每一代人都必须获得自己的成功。硅谷的基金们会怎么遴选他们的接班人呢？红杉的二代掌门人相比他的创始人风格展现了很大的差异吗？可以对比聊聊唐瓦伦丁和他的接班人。
It's interesting. I mean, Michael Moritz is an example of somebody who really had a different background to the other people in Silicon Valley. I mean, he wasn't really blue collar, to go back to your early question, but he grew up in the United Kingdom, in Wales, so not in a famous city. And he was Jewish, which made him maybe a little bit outside the mainstream of British life. And as soon as he finished his studies at Oxford, he immediately went to America, and he studied in America, and then he became a journalist. So he was a writer at Time magazine. He wrote a couple of books, And then he became an entrepreneur. The company he started didn't do very well. And then he joined Sequoia. So he did all these different things. And he was not an engineer by training. He was not a salesperson. He did not go to Stanford. So in many ways, he was not a typical Silicon Valley kind of character.
Yeah.
And very different to, Don Valentine. Don Valentine, as I said, was this powerfully built, Navy water polo player, quite sort of rude to people who were too fancy. He liked to pick a fight with them. When I went to interview him before he died, he picked fights with me before I could see him. He would say, "Who are you? I don't like you, and this is stupid." And then he would sort of like not answer the email for another week or two. Wow. And then he would say, "Well, let's talk on the phone." And he would shout at me at the beginning of the phone call because he wanted to just test me and see if I was worth talking to. And finally, he agreed to see me, and I went all the way to Arizona where he was living. On the way to the meeting, I was in the Uber, and I telephoned him from my cell phone and said, "I'm coming, I'm on the way." And he said, "Oh, go away. I don't want to talk to you. This is a totally stupid meeting." And I would say, "Oh, but I've come all the way from England to see you. And I live in London, and now I'm in Arizona, and I'm almost there in the Uber. You must see me." And then he would see me, and he would spend 2 hours talking to me, and he was very charming. But he was a difficult person sometimes, whereas Michael Moritz is this elegant writer, very cultured, very kind of wise, and also a little bit aggressive sometimes, but very different characters. So I think it tells you something about Don Valentine's talent, that he was willing to choose a successor who was similar to him in that he could be competitive and aggressive and hungry, but different to him in that he was just a very different character. So Daglione was maybe a little bit more like Don Valentine in his style of upbringing. He also was a bit more blue collar. He had grown up as the son of Italian immigrants and sort of resented the richer kids and wanted to prove that, by working incredibly hard, he could get ahead. He was an engineer. He'd worked as an engineer earlier on. And so he had more of the Don Valentine kind of personality. And by the way, also of the physical appearance, a very strong guy who lifted weights, get up early in the morning to lift. Said, I think, in one of my early drafts of my manuscript, I wrote something around, how he had the heavy build of a weightlifter. When he found out I was writing that, he got very cross and said, "Oh, well, I'm fit. I'm fit, but I'm not just a meathead." But he really is built, very strong. Whereas, Michael Moritz is sort of, slim and likes to go on bicycles and exercise by being a fast cyclist. Don Valentine is there, like that. And Daglione, like that. So, different characters. But that's the strength of the partnership. Rudolf Botha, who then was chosen to be the next leader of Sequoia in America, is a rugby player, South African type of character. Again, a different sport and a different personality.
为什么硅谷的 VC 总是倾向于同时任命2个 GP?
I think that they thought that a team was better than an individual sometimes. That was a bit of a sensitive question, whether, the Michael Moritz Daglione partnership was, 2 equals, or whether Michael Moritz was really the more equal, okay. the more senior one. And I don't think they ever really quite agreed on that. But in any event, I think the ability to work in a team and to understand that it's not about individuals, it's about Sequoia, is important to the institution. My impression is that in Sequoia, China, it's a bit different. You know, Neil Shen has been the undisputed leader all the time. And so they have a slightly different model. In a way, though, the fact that the American leaders of Sequoia were willing to choose Neil Shen and allow him to become the dominant person and to have a more, sort of single leader model than they would have in America. That shows respect for, the differences in China. As you know, at the beginning with Sequoia China, they picked two people.
Yeah.
One of those people left after a few years, and Shen became the undisputed top guy. So the Americans let the Chinese partners find their own correct model for China. And maybe that's another strength of Sequoia. When they were both running Sequoia together, Michael Moritz, I think, had more of the sort of decision-making about whether to have an office in China, whether to have an office in India, whether to start a hedge fund. But Doug Leone was very important in making it happen. Once they decided to have an office in China, Doug Leone went to China to try to find people who could be the head of Sequoia China, and he met a lot of people. And he was a really hard worker and a really solid leader. But I think maybe Moritz had more of the sort of sparkle and the vision.
我很好奇的是，硅谷风投机构的 leader 他们会选择在多少岁的时候退休？
Well, I mean, it depends on the individual. I mean, there are people who stand back as young as, 40, and there are some who carry on when they're, moving towards 70. So there's no rule. I think, it's about how much energy you have, how much passion you have to carry on finding new ideas. I think there are some people who, as they get older, they are more keen to stay as venture capitalists because the buzz of meeting young entrepreneurs and having ideas sort of keeps you young.
如果红杉失败了，会是因为什么？
Yeah, I mean, I suppose Sequoia is making, big, dangerous bets. For example, opening an office in a new place or starting a new kind of business line. I think they're pretty careful when they do that not to make it so big that they would really risk the whole thing. So I think the way that venture capital companies, when they're very established, can fail is by choosing the wrong person to be the next leader. If you choose somebody who, alienates the colleagues, the other talent starts to leave and set up other companies, then you can fail. And I think in a way that's what happened with Kleiner Perkins, that there was a time in the 1990s when there were several very talented people at the top. There was John Doerr, but there was also Vinod Khosla, who was, as good as John Doerr. And the two of them together were a great partnership. And there were some other people as well who kind of made the culture of the organization work. And when those other people left, John Doerr was sort of the sole boss. And he just wasn't very good at doing that by himself. So if you chose the wrong person, then I think you can destroy the franchise.
在硅谷的风投的历史上，还有两个疯狂的大人物孙正义和尤里米尔纳，他们从多大程度改变了硅谷的游戏规则呢？
Yes, both Masayoshi Son and Yuri Milner had the idea of investing bigger amounts of money into companies, sort of not just when they're very, very young, but later when they might be about to do an IPO, go on the stock market. Masayoshi Son and Yuri Milner would say, well, instead of going to get capital on the stock market, why don't you stay private a bit longer? I'll give you the money. And so this is called growth investing, which allows the company to grow. Once it's already going, it's already got customers, it's already really doing well, but it's going to grow to a bigger size without going to the public stock market. And, that becomes a very powerful way of making a lot of money when all the tech sector is going up. But it also becomes a powerful way of losing money when all of the tech sector goes down, because you're writing big checks and you're kind of betting on just technology doing well, as opposed to a particular startup doing well.
这两个疯狂的男人都没有出生于美国，他们一个来自日本，一个来自俄罗斯，但是改变了硅谷的游戏规则。您怎么看这个现象？
Well, it's a good sign of how Silicon Valley has been open to foreign talent, and the rules have allowed somebody to come in and shake things up, which I think is one source of innovation. Famously in Silicon Valley, something like 2/5 or 40% of the companies that get founded are started by somebody not born in the United States. So it's a system that relies on fresh talent from outside, and I think that's one of the strengths of Silicon Valley.
为什么孙正义这种激进的投资风格这么多年都有效，但是最近却失效了？您怎么看待他最近的一条新闻，是声称要淡出软银的日常经营管理？
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about this big checks into established tech companies on the theory that they're going to grow really, really fast. It works and makes a lot of money if it goes right. But it also collapses. If all of the tech stocks suddenly collapse, and you've got these big investments in big tech companies, they just are going to go down really fast. And so Masayoshi Son was the richest man in the world in the year 2000. And then the NASDAQ market crashed in March 2000, and he lost something like 97% of his money, 97%. And the same kind of thing happened recently where, during the early part of COVID, technology stocks did incredibly well. And in 2021, Masayoshi Son was probably making more money than anybody in the world, maybe apart from Elon Musk. But then, the technology sector crashed, and Masayoshi Son lost a ton of money. And I think, he's done well for a long time, but very volatile. Now he says he's stepping back. We'll see if he remains in the background. Sometimes people say they are leaving, but they are too addicted to the excitement of investing to really fade away.
还有一些别具特色的风投机构，比如说 Benchmark、Founders Fund、YC 和 Excel， 他们对于风投历史的贡献是什么呢？
Well, YC is a good one to start with because it's so different. Y Combinator was started in 2005, and the idea was that it would create a summer camp for students who were maybe studying, computer science, and they had an idea for a company, and they had a friend maybe to help them, but they really just had an idea. They had nothing more than an idea. And they would come to Y Combinator, first in Boston, and then later it was in Silicon Valley. And they would work on their new idea, and they would spend maybe 8 weeks or 10 weeks in this sort of summer camp. Every Tuesday, they would come to dinner at the summer camp, and they would meet the other young computer scientists trying to have ideas for companies, and they would, have an informal meal together, listen to a lecture. They would hang out with Paul Graham, the founder of Y Combinator, who would give them some advice. And at the end of the 8 weeks or the end of the 10 weeks, they would give a report on what they had achieved to try to develop the idea. And then they would try to get a real venture capital investment. But so it was really kind of pre-venture capital. It was the earlier part of the development. And it was a way to make it easier for somebody who came from outside Silicon Valley, from outside the establishment, to go from just having an idea in your head to actually having a proper company plan. And Y Combinator did very well. Some of the early examples of companies that came out of that were Stripe, which became a very, very powerful, wealthy payments company, fintech company in the US. And also Airbnb came out of this. So that did extremely well. That was the contribution of Y Combinator, the idea of the incubator before venture capital. You mentioned Benchmark.
Yes.
And Benchmark was more of a traditional early stage Series A funder, rather like Accel. Accel got started earlier in the 1980s, and the idea was to be specialized in certain kinds of technology. They specialized in software and telecommunications. And then Benchmark came in 1995 and had the idea again of not investing a lot of money, but going early and really focusing on a few founders that they thought were particularly promising, and having the Benchmark partner really become a partner to the entrepreneur, to go on the board and invest a lot of energy and time in helping that entrepreneur build the company. So that's the sort of classic Series A venture capital model. And Founders Fund started another 10 years later in 2005. So again, Accel 1983, Benchmark 1995, Founders Fund 2005. So there's about 10 years between each of these. And with Founders Fund, the idea was to put the founder first, to respect the entrepreneur, not to have the threat of firing the entrepreneur if the venture capitalist decided that the entrepreneur was no good. Founders Fund wanted to promise that it would always support the entrepreneur no matter what happened. And that therefore gave the emphasis on finding a slightly crazy entrepreneur who maybe would be very unconventional, but nonetheless, the investors would always support that entrepreneur. It was founded by Peter Thiel, who made contrarianism into a bit of a religion, and also was the first person to write about the Power Law, which became my book title, and to emphasize how it's all about backing some crazy people who do crazy things that make tons of money, and don't worry about the majority of the companies that may fail.
在您书中出现的这些大名鼎鼎的风险投资家们，他们有共性吗？是什么让他们站在了舞台中心？
I mean, one thing they have in common is they have to be good at the emotional intelligence side of investing. You know, with hedge funds, you can be very analytical and not talk to very many people, and that's fine. With venture capital, you have to go and meet the entrepreneur. You have to become connected with the entrepreneur, and you have to really be there for the entrepreneur when the company is in difficulty and it's Friday night and you receive a phone call and the entrepreneur is, ready to give up because, two people have quit and the product is not going very well and there's some problems. You have to be willing to kind of go to that startup and sit with the entrepreneur through the weekend and encourage them to have the courage to get up and go again. So there is an emotional intelligence side to venture capital, which I think almost all of these VCs must have.
这带来了下一个问题，就是风险投资人和您之前写的那本书《富可敌国》里描述的对冲基金的基金经理们，这两个群体所需要的资质和禀赋有差异吗？
Yes, well, I've just mentioned that the venture capitalists are more about meeting people. Hedge fund people, in a way, can be rather insular. There was a joke when I wrote my book about hedge funds that one of the hedge fund managers, Lewis Bacon, became very successful and bought an island, a private island. And people said, it doesn't make any difference because he's already like an island. He's already this single person behind lots of different trading screens, screen here, screen there, screen there. He's hiding and he's, by himself. So he can have an island and be by himself, but there's no difference.
这些人中您最欣赏谁？
Well, in a way, I would say Michael Moritz from Sequoia, because he had the courage to really change what Sequoia was, to go from a small Silicon Valley early stage company investor to setting up in China, setting up in India, setting up in Southeast Asia, creating a growth investment business, creating a hedge fund inside Sequoia, even creating an endowment investment business, which is another kind of structure. So he was willing to really bet the franchise. And when you ask him, which is your favorite investment you've ever done? Mm-hmm. He won't say it was Yahoo, which he invested in. He won't say it was Google, which he invested in. He will say it was Sequoia itself, because making all those bets on growing Sequoia is the thing that he is the most proud of.
非常有意思的一点是，他也是当年在《时代》杂志报道过 Arthur Rock 的记者。
Yes, I mean, Michael Moritz was a journalist, and he also wrote a couple of books before he became an investor. And of course, one of the things he wrote about was, business leaders. And the first book was actually about Chrysler, the big car company, which had gone wrong and gone bankrupt in 1979. So that was a book about how big companies can be too bureaucratic and fail. And then the second book he wrote was about Apple and Steve Jobs. So that was about how a small company can be exciting and succeed. And along the way, Michael Moritz also wrote a cover story in Time magazine about Arthur Rock, and that allowed him to understand what venture capital was and how it worked. So I think through his writing, he was a student of entrepreneurship and big companies and venture capital. So he understood a lot about investing before he became an investor.
Why did he choose to become a venture capitalist?
He always said later that he wished he had done it earlier. I think he, had become a writer because he thought it was an exciting way to study the world. And then at a certain point, he wanted to just not study the world, but actually, make the money himself and, make an impact, maybe not just through writing, but through making investment decisions.
投资人们总是会说，投资的诀窍在于投对的人。在您看来，什么是对的人呢？
Well, I think it is, first of all, having a different idea. If you do a startup and you do something that another company is already doing, there's no way it can work, right? Because the other company is established, it's bigger, it's more powerful. The only way you can win is by doing something new. So you have to have that idea, and then you have to have the character to believe in that idea, even though most people are saying it's not going to work, because it's new and, it looks crazy at the beginning. And so you have to have the belief in yourself to stick with the idea, to work with it, even when most people think you're crazy. And you have to be willing to accept that it probably will fail. Most startups do fail. So it takes a certain kind of determination, self-belief, and almost craziness to want to do this. So I think those are some of the qualities that a venture capitalist is looking for.
在这些大人物们中，谁在哪一个项目赚到了最多的钱？ Among the big names, who made the most money on a single deal?
I would say it's probably the Masayoshi Son investment in Alibaba.
How much
that
money?
Was I'm forgetting, but I mean billions of dollars he made, because he invested very early. Goldman Sachs had done the early investment, but the leaders of Goldman Sachs decided that they wanted to be a bank and they didn't want to be a venture capital operator. And so they sold their investment stupidly very early to Masayoshi Son. And so Masayoshi Son had the opportunity to get in and and buy a chunk of Alibaba, and then it went up, and he held it for a long time. So he made really, I think, billions of dollars on that.
在书中您写到成功有很多父亲，硅谷也不例外。在您看来，谁是硅谷的成功之父？
Well, I think it's really Arthur Rock. And the reason I think that is that, venture capital, I think, was the key reason why Silicon Valley became the dominant technology center in the world for a long, long time, until China became the big challenger. Some people, when I began researching my book, would tell me the reason Silicon Valley did well was Stanford University. But that's not true, because MIT was a better engineering university at the beginning. Some people told me that Silicon Valley did well because defense contracts were awarded to Silicon Valley companies. And so the first semiconductors were sold to make weapons for the American military. But this story about defense contracts isn't really the main reason, because again, there were more defense contracts in the Boston area than in Silicon Valley. So if you want to understand why Silicon Valley became the top place for innovation, it's because of the business culture, because it had more startups, because the startups were more aggressive in trying to really build themselves and make commercial success. Why did those startups have that culture in Silicon Valley? I think it's because the venture capitalists made it possible. They were willing to put money behind people who just had an idea, even if they didn't really yet have any customers, even if they weren't sure if the product would even work. And the venture capitalists were special in Silicon Valley. They took more risk. They were willing to accept failure. They understood the Power Law, which said that a few successes could make up for all of the losses when you're doing very risky investing. And so if you want to understand the origin of Silicon Valley, you have to understand the origin of venture capital. And that origin came when Arthur Rock invested in Fairchild Semiconductor in 1957.
在这些大人物中，谁是您认为的最疯狂的那个人？
Well, Masayoshi Son was pretty crazy. He would, make these bets very quickly, meeting companies sometimes for, just half an hour. And then he would say, yes, I'm going to back you and I'm going to give you a lot of money. And then instead of being a bit worried about his investment, he would say to the entrepreneur, I want you to be bigger, faster, crazier. And so entrepreneurs are often a bit crazy, and he would try to make them even more crazy. So I think if you want crazy, Masayoshi Son was crazy.
很少有人关注到风投网络，是什么让您关注到这个人际网络存在的？网络在哪些方面驱动了创新？
Yes, the network drives innovation because it's all about connecting the entrepreneurs to other people who can help them build the company. So when you have a startup, you always have to fight to persuade talented engineers to come and work and help you to build the product. And the engineers are frightened about joining your company because it might fail at the beginning. And then you have to hire talented salespeople to sell the product. And the salespeople don't want to join because they're frightened that it might fail. But if you have a venture capitalist who is a famous venture capitalist, the venture capitalist can say to the early engineers and salespeople, look, if you join this startup and it fails, don't worry, because I have lots of other startups that I am backing, and I will get you a job at one of these other places. So when I was doing my research, I spoke to Eric Schmidt, who became the chief executive of Google early on. And at first, Eric Schmidt didn't want to join Google. He said, look, these founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, they are very young, they're very arrogant, they do not respect anybody who is over 30 years old. And I am Eric Schmidt, I am the chief executive of another software company. Why would I take the risk of joining these young guys when they might just decide they don't like me and kick me out? And John Doerr said, he was the venture capitalist who was persuading Eric Schmidt to join Google. John Doerr said, yes, Eric, you're right. They are very arrogant. They might kick you out, but don't worry. If they do that, I will make you the chief executive of another software company. And so I think by turning a single shot game, which is very risky, into a repeat game, venture capitalists create the courage that entrepreneurs need, that people who join startups need. And in this way, I sometimes call venture capital a machine for manufacturing courage, because the network creates the courage that venture capitalists need, that entrepreneurs need, and that early engineers who join the startups, the courage needs to be created.
Yes.
And they won't have the courage unless the venture capitalist is there to say, don't worry, I'm going to give you the capital, I'm going to help you, I'm going to show you how you build the startup. I've done it before with other startups. Trust me, I can make it work.
您在书中引用了一个观点，我觉得非常有趣。大量的松散的关系比少数的紧密的关系更有利于思想的分享和创新。相比少量的强关系，大量的弱关系能产生更多的信息流通。可以进一步阐释这一点吗？
Yes, I mean, when I was thinking about why the Boston Technology Center, which had MIT as the best engineering university and which had a lot of technology companies like Raytheon, which was a big defense company, Wang, Digital Equipment Corporation. So it was a very strong engineering and tech center. But in the 1980s, Silicon Valley overtook it and did better. And I was trying to understand, why did Silicon Valley do better? And I came up with this idea not from economics, because I couldn't find anything in economics that explained this, but rather from sociology. And there's a sociologist called Mark Granovetter who wrote a paper called The Strength of Weak Ties. And his point was that if you have, let's say, 100 people in your Rolodex, in your network, and you know them not very well, but you know a little bit about them, and you've done some communication with them, and you know them enough to send them a message. That might be better when you're trying to think of a company, build a company, find customers for your company, than if you have, let's say, 12 people, and they're really close friends, you really work with them deeply, and you have these deep ties. Because, you know, if you've got lots of loose ties, it gives you lots of options. If you have a small number of deep ties, there are not so many choices you can make about how you might hire new people or develop new customers. And really, the thing about Boston is that people worked in companies and they stayed inside one company. So they developed these deep ties with maybe 12 people inside that company who were their friends, who worked with them closely. Whereas in Silicon Valley, there were lots of startups. People would join a startup. The startup would fail after 1 year. They would join another startup, spend 3 years at that one. They would move around. They would share ideas with people from other startups who they used to work with 5 years earlier. So there were lots of weak ties. And in that Silicon Valley system, ideas and money and people circulate very fast. And it's more productive, more fertile. So if you think about a garden with lots of flowers, you need bees to fly around the garden, buzz, 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 and move the pollen from one flower to the other flower. And venture capitalists are like this, connecting up all the flowers. And it's that loose network with loose ties that creates more creativity than the kind of tightly narrow Boston system.
我知道你有一些中国的企业家和投资人的朋友们，你怎么看待风险投资进入中国以后呈现出的中国特色？中国的风投和硅谷的风投最大的区别是什么？
The Chinese venture capital system did incredibly well, really, really fast. Starting with Alibaba and Baidu and Tencent, which did in the late 1990s. It only took about 15 years for China to be as big as Silicon Valley in terms of the creation of unicorns and success. So I think one difference is that China grew faster. Of course, China had a very fast growing economy at the time, growing at 10% a year sometimes. So I think that helped venture capital to grow very, very quickly. But in a way, what's amazing about China and the story in China is how similar it was to the American story, because the style of the venture capital that grew up in China was very closely linked to the American style, because it was companies like Sequoia that brought the model to China, and so they had studied the American playbook. And they often used the same things like stock options for the early employees, which was an idea that came from America and was used in China. So I think there's a lot of similarities as well as a few differences with the United States.
过去20年，中国风投率先的解放的不是科学家，而是一批在手机上做 App 的人。这带来了中国移动互联网生态的蓬勃，诞生了很多我们都熟知的公司，比如说字节、滴滴、美团。直到最近1-2年，中国风险投资业才开始集体的转向硬科技的赛道。您怎么看待这个现象？
I would say that China has also had quite a strong medical technology sector. You would know better than me, but I think, it's not all apps, right? But the other thing I would say is that, if you look at the American story, there was a phase of hardware when venture capital began. So the early investments were in semiconductors, then they were in personal computers, then they were in routers and equipment that would support the computer. And then from maybe 1990 or so, software became a big deal. And with the internet becoming established in around 1995, with the flotation of Netscape, then software and internet apps really began to dominate venture capital. And this was, of course, the time when China got going in the late 1990s. And so it was natural that because of where technology was in the late 1990s, yes, app developers in China were the main story for venture capital. But it's good to remember that there was, before the 1990s, this old hardware story. And maybe now we're going back to hardware, both in China and in America to some extent, because things like, artificial intelligence is a new kind of software, I guess. So that's pushing software into sort of deep tech, but it's still software. But then there's hardware like building drones and DJI, like building batteries, and I know the electric vehicle and battery industry is growing incredibly fast in China. So I think that venture capital can be very useful for robotics and deep tech hardware. And I think it's natural to expect that in the next 10 years, maybe software will not be the only theme. There will be hardware as well.
您在书中提到，硅谷式的风投启动了中国的数字经济，并且中国的风投有一项显著的优势，就是它对女性更开放，这是真的吗？您从哪些观察中得出了这个结论？
Yeah, I mean, when I went to China in 1999, before I go on these trips, I always try to ask people I know who are the most interesting and strongest investors, and I came up with a list which I wasn't particularly, looking for gender balance, but it turned out that there were several women on the list in China. Kathy Zhu from Capital Today was one. I'm going to forget some of the other names, but at Zhen Fund, I met the young. Yeah. And then I'm going to say the name wrong, but Xia Hong Chen, somebody who had worked with Tiger.
in Beijing.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So I went to see her, and it did seem like there were more women. And of course, Shirley Lin, the Taiwanese American at Goldman Sachs, who was the first investor in Alibaba, was in a way the Arthur Rock for the Chinese venture world, because she did the Alibaba investment and that kickstarted everything. And again, she was the youngest woman partner at Goldman Sachs, and so a pioneering woman. And I thought that was interesting that there seemed to be more women, maybe because, the American venture system got going way back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when there was less gender equality, whereas the Chinese one got going in the 90s and 2000s when maybe things were a bit more equal.
作为金融历史学家，您怎么看待我们目前所处的经济周期和您历史上研究的周期哪个阶段呈现出了相似性？您对年轻的读者们是否有一些应对萧条的建议？
It is rather similar to what happened in 2000 when the NASDAQ stock exchange collapsed. There was a lot of pain at that time. Enormous numbers of companies went bust. And in a way, you could say, just simplifying a little bit, that there were two kinds of companies in Silicon Valley. There were, what they called vaporware, meaning, sort of internet e-commerce companies, which only survived because they had cheap capital from venture capitalists. And they could do a lot of advertising to try to get customers. And when the cheap capital stopped, they couldn't advertise and they just went bust. So that was one kind of company. And then the other kind was sort of IT companies that were selling services to the first kind. So when the first kind went bust, they went bust too. So a lot of companies failed in that period in the early 2000s. And even a company like Amazon, which we now think of as, incredibly successful, almost went bust in that period. It had a really hard time. So I think the lesson from history is, look, these things happen. They are very painful for maybe 1 or 2 years. But then the system as a whole goes through and you start getting big successes again. And the reason is that fundamentally technology is still the way to build wealth. It's still the way to build the future. And if you have good technology, venture capital is the best way to invest in it, because you run lots of experiments with small investments in different startup ideas, and some of them will hopefully work. And so I think fundamentally, venture capital plus entrepreneurs plus new ideas is the way to build the new future. Even though we go through these moments, which might last for a year or two, we should keep our optimism.
最后，我想问您一些关于写作的问题。您在写这本书的过程中遇到最大的挫折是什么？
Well, there were setbacks at the beginning because, people didn't necessarily want to tell me their secrets. They didn't want to spend, 2 hours speaking to a writer. Why would they spend that time? And so you have to build a network, and you have to get to know the people who will introduce you to other people who will introduce you to the really important people. So you have to be willing to spend a year or two networking. That takes, courage in a way, because at the beginning, you don't know if you're going to ultimately get the success. But the thing is, I've done this before. I've done it with hedge funds. At the beginning, nobody wanted to speak to me. And at the end, everybody wanted to speak to me, because by the end, everybody has heard that you have access to all of the top investors. And so the other investors you haven't spoken to yet, they want to speak to you as well, because they don't want to be left out. And so I remember one moment with hedge funds when, I was having a sandwich by myself, just thinking about my book, and my phone rang, and it was one of the hedge fund managers who had refused to speak to me before. And now he was calling me and saying, well, maybe we should talk, because he had learned that the man who had been his deputy for 15 years had just had dinner with me and had spoken for 4 hours. And so he knew he better speak to me. So this is what happens at the end of the project. At the end, everybody wants to talk to you. At the beginning, nobody wants to talk to you, but you have to kind of keep trying. And in the end, I think you succeed.
采访完成后，您会给当事人做信息核实吗？有人会感到不满意而要求修改吗？您会如何应对？
Yes, that's a good question, because I do believe in sharing the draft and going through revisions. And, the reason is that I think if you give the book manuscript, like you give the draft to somebody, and you say, look, I am an independent writer. I'm not promising to change things, but I am promising to listen to what you say. Then people will, read it. And first of all, they might correct a couple of factual mistakes, which is great. But then they may also say, look, what you've written is good, but you've missed out a whole emphasis, a whole angle that would be interesting as well. And then you can talk for another 2 hours and you get more access and you learn more things and you revise it because you've learned more things. And that makes it a better book. It's closer to the truth, and the reader benefits from a book that explains things better. And I don't think you lose independence because you haven't promised to change it. Mm-hmm. And in the end, I wrote things that John Doerr at Kleiner Perkins did not like. And I wrote some things that people at Sequoia did not like. But, they understand that at least I listened. And more importantly, the reader understands that I really had deep access, and I went back for additional information, and I revised the book to get closer to the truth. I think that the Sequoia people wish there were certain things I had done differently. They also suffered a little bit in Europe because the European venture capitalists were sort of jealous and competitive with Sequoia. And when I wrote my book and I said that Sequoia was great, and that when Sequoia came to Europe, it would be the signal for the European venture capital system to do better and take off and become better and more sophisticated, there were a lot of European venture capitalists who got very angry, and they attacked Sequoia, they attacked me. But, hey, I think that was a bit embarrassing for a while for Sequoia, but it's okay. They're going to do fine. And I think that on the other hand, I said a lot of positive things about Sequoia as well, because they are the most successful venture company, and I think they deserve a positive profile. So, they are a bit mad at me for some things, but mostly they are happy.
一般来说有2类成功的记者，一种是像您这样出版图书成为作家，另一种是成为媒体的高层人士，就像您妻子那样，她是经济学人的总编辑。您认为哪条路更难？
Oh, well, I think my wife, is definitely the superior journalist. She's editing a magazine where, more than 1 million people read it every week. That's a lot of power. And I have a lot of respect for her. My books do well, and, maybe a few 100,000 people read them, but it's not as influential as a top magazine like The Economist.
您从什么时候意识到自己要成为一名作家？
When I was very young, when I was 15 or 16, I was asked at my school to say, what did I want to do for my job later? And I said I would like to be a journalist and a book writer. And that's exactly what I did. So I've always wanted to do this.
在您的记者生涯中有体验过 The Power Law 的魔法吗？写完这本书以后 The Power Law 的理念是否指导了您的个人生活？
I do think that the idea of taking a risk and betting on a difficult subject, doing something that other writers haven't done, taking a long time and understanding it's going to be hard, so it will take a long time. I think those kinds of sort of being a bit like an entrepreneur is the right approach for books. Sometimes, I mean, I do spend 5 years on each book, that's a lot longer than most writers choose to spend. And it's a big investment, but I think in the end you create something more distinctive, more different, and you have a chance of, producing an original contribution. And then if that works, then, the first 100 people read it and they think, oh, this is different, it's good. And then they tell 100 more people, their friends, and then they tell more people, and then you do get a power law effect. And so I had that experience with my book about hedge funds. When I first published it, I hoped it was good, but I didn't know how much it would sell. And then bit by bit, as more readers liked it, they told more other people. And there was a kind of power law explosion in the sales. And what's interesting is that, now it's been 12 years since I wrote that book. And still, every week it's selling, more copies. And I still get emails from readers who say, oh, I just read it. And so I never expected that book to be read for more than a decade, but that's what's happened.
当您开始写一本书之后，您的工作节奏是什么样的呢？
Well, you have to be flexible with your schedule because you have to fit in with the important subjects you want to write about. So if one of the venture capitalists I was trying to write about would say, oh, I could see you next week. What about lunch in San Francisco? I would have to drop everything and go to San Francisco and meet him for lunch because you mustn't miss that chance. And, if somebody else says, I'm going to meet you in San Francisco next week, and then he cancels, you mustn't get angry. You must just say, hey, no problem. Let's just reschedule. What about next week? And you have to be ready to do what it takes to get to see those people, because that's the only way you're going to understand the secret methods of how you invest venture capital. And so I think, when that was not happening, I would have a routine with my writing. I would basically get up in the morning, try to sleep as much as possible. I believe in a lot of sleep. Then I would exercise quite hard for maybe 45 minutes to really feel strong and fresh. And then I would be able to get to my desk with a big cup of coffee and write for 9 or 10 hours with all that sleep and all that coffee and all that exercise inside me. And the best kind of day is where, nobody's emailing me, nobody's telephoning me. I just get to think about the writing and there's no interruption. That's how I really make progress with the writing. But, as I said, if somebody from one of my sources is in touch, then I have to drop the writing straight away and respond to them.
您写作过5本书，哪一本书是您最喜欢的？
I think the biggest turning point was the hedge fund history, More Money Than God, because it was the first one that really sold a lot of copies. And had this staying power and kind of put my name on the map as a writer who kind of benefited from the power law. And the next book about Alan Greenspan won the Financial Times Best Book of the Year award. So that was quite a big prize. So that was good. But I think that was less important than the breakthrough with More Money Than God. My favorite book is probably the new one, The Power Law, because venture capital is so exciting. The making of the new future, the discovery of new products, the excitement of building a startup company into a unicorn. I mean, there's nothing, I think, as magical as that. And so I think of all my books, The Power Law is maybe the most exciting. And although it's still a new book, it looks as if the readers agree, and it sold even more Money Than God in America and in Europe.
能不能透露您下一步的写作计划？
Well, I haven't exactly decided, but I'm hoping to write something about artificial intelligence. And but I have to negotiate with the people. It's always this question of getting access to the right people. And so I'm just having conversations now to see if that's possible.
This land is your land, and this land is my land, and the California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me.